All right, hello and welcome to the Cerium Journal Club for September 2025. And today we'll be discussing a session we're calling Reviewing Risk and Methods in Heart Research. Do the numbers add up? My name is Jehan Marku. I have a PhD from Temple University studying cannabinoids, and joining me today is Dr. Phil Malloy. He's a medical doctor and has. Phil, do you want to tell a little bit about your background?
Yes, I am rheumatologist and autoimmune disease by training. And as I get older, my retirement passion has been educating healthcare providers about cannabis.
Excellent. So we are coming today from Physicians Research Center. They support this journal club and they offer education as well as research and other consulting opportunities. If you have not had a chance, you can fill out our questionnaire for healthcare professionals. We're happy to come back to this slide. Again, just letting you know about our journal club. Our mission is to support the education of healthcare professionals with discussions of published research, and we do our best to approach each paper with consistency, fairness, and transparency. And we encourage you to share this link with your colleagues. It's the same link every month, first Tuesday of the month. So please share it. We we realize that sometimes we have to make a bit of a declaration about the journal club because our purpose is to letting two people in. Our purpose is to educate and raise awareness and engage in a professional exchange. We're not recommending policy or regulatory decisions. We don't have skin in the game and agenda other than education and talking about research, which today is the article entitled Cardiovascular Risk Associated with the Use of Cannabis and Cannabinoids, a Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis by Storck and colleagues, which was published this year and, and actually got a fair amount of headlines. Now, Dr. Malloy, you had sent me this list of things to
Yeah.
ponder. Do you want to run through the ponderings before we jump
Well,
into the data?
I'm not the best person to give you my up-to-date experience with interacting with patients since I'm trying to retire and I stopped seeing patients 2 years ago. But even before I retired, I had a busy practice, and rheumatologists see people with a lot of pain and elderly patients. And as the years went by, recently, patients are more proactive in asking me about it, especially if you live in a state where it's become more liberal and legalized on both medical and recreational. I have my own personal experience is that in addition to media attention, when articles like this come up, is that patients are more and more willing. By the way, one of the things on Jehan's previous slide that we're not trying to do, and we don't have skin in the game, is to tell you how to have conversation with patients. Our goal, the two of us and more of us that are involved with Cerium, is to poke you to learn more about this so that you can have conversations with your patients in any way your conscience wants you to. My own experience, and this is overwhelmingly, is that patients are more likely to ask me about benefit. Will this help my pain? Will this help my sleep? Will this help my nausea? Than they are to ask about. They never think to ask about safety. For example, is it safe for me to drive with this? I'm thinking about getting pregnant. Is it safe for me to use this? I never get safety questions, but I get benefit questions all the time, as if we're trying to, as if patients think that we are withholding some magic treatment that would really help them a lot. I've heard this helps. My friends tell me, I saw on TV, I saw this, I saw that. How come you haven't recommended this to me? Is more the attitude I've been experiencing.
Well, thank you, Phil. We say we go to those poll questions because I think it aligns well with this pondering as we go into this meta-analysis. So this is a bit of a um, interactive time if you'd like. We have a few poll questions. Would love you to fill them out. We'll just leave the poll open for probably 2 minutes or less. And the questions are things like, there is controlled prospective RCT evidence, that's randomized controlled trials, that cannabis use is causally associated with adverse CV outcomes. Some of these are opinion based. We're just trying to get a sense of anonymously of where we're at with some of these things. I'm inclined, for example, the second question is, I'm inclined to believe that cannabis use is causally associated with adverse cardiovascular outcomes. Number 3, I am satisfied that well-done meta-analyses provide conclusions as reliable and believable as prospective randomized controlled trials. And then we have some questions at the end about patients receiving DOAs or drugs of abuse screens and your thoughts on that. We have some answered right away, but if you're able to, perhaps hopefully you're not driving and journal clubbing and you can answer some of these questions, that would be great. I see some more results coming in. Awesome. We'll leave it open for just a few more seconds. Looks like some people changed their answers. Always great. See people thinking. Oh my gosh, we have 100% participation. Excellent. All right, so we're going to end this results poll and we're going to share the results. So for the first question, there's controlled prospective randomized controlled trials that cannabis use is causally associated with adverse CV outcomes. So this one did have a correct answer and it is false. 100% of you got that correct. Number 2, I am inclined to believe that cannabis use is causally associated with adverse CV outcomes. We have about 20% responding true and 80% responding false. This one, number 3, is very interesting for me. Is I am satisfied that well done meta-analyses provide conclusions as reliable and believable as prospective randomized controlled studies. And there we see a little bit of a split. 40% say, hey, meta-analyses are the top of the research pyramid. Nothing better than a meta-analysis. And then we have some people saying, I don't know, those really controlled studies, like we might think about a drug and a placebo group, those are the best. And then we have questions about all patients presenting with acute cardiovascular events should have a drug screen. So most people said yes, and same thing about young patients with cardiovascular events, and everyone said previously low risk patients presenting with acute cardiovascular events should have a DOA screen. 100% say number 6, which is interesting. Very interesting to see these results. I wonder how people will feel about number 1 and number 2 as we move through these results. So excellent.
I have a comment, just a quick comment, Jehan, is that
Yeah.
only previously high risk, low risk patients has the potential to introduce bias. Right, I'm going to order it on you, but I'm not going to order it on you. I don't like your accent. I don't like your tattoos and nose jewelry. I'm going to order a drug screen on you. You wear a suit today, so I'm not going to order it on you. We do have subliminal biases, and if you're going to order it on anybody, a case could be made to order it on everybody. And you pick up opioids and cannabis products, which have a lot of bearings. We had a journal club, not to stray, a few months ago on complications after joint elective surgery, like joint replacements in the hospital. And it's a strong association with cannabis. People who screen positive on admission have more complications and worse surgical outcomes. I think you could make a case that you want to know. That's all.
I like it. Be fair and consistent. All right. So why do we kind of care about the cardiovascular issues? Well, it's over $350 billion is the economic burden of cardiovascular disease. Let me get back to my pointer here. And you know, endocannabinoid receptors are ubiquitous, expressed throughout the cardiovascular system. And THC is known to be associated with many cardiovascular effects. In animal models exposed to secondhand smoke exhibit endothelial dysfunction, which is thought to be a precursor to cardiovascular disease in animal models. And there is an increase in intentional and accidental exposure being more commonly reported, such as with adverse events and things like that. And the CDC reports, or their latest numbers include a 15.9% report of increase in people using it within the last month. Another interesting thing is that we have covered this before in our journal club. This is an issue. If you missed the June 2024 journal club, it was a big hit, as you can see. It made the paper. Some called it the best journal club of all time, but we we discussed an original article by Jeffers, which was Association of Cannabis Use with Cardiovascular Disease. We have a replay of this available. But again, this seems to be the question of cannabis and cardiovascular effects seems to come up fairly often. If not every year, every few months, there seems to be some discussion in the mainstream media as well as in the scientific literature. And in that study that made a fair amount of waves, they did find an increase of risk associated with cardiovascular events. So, Phil, do you want to take them through the methods?
Sure. So the strength of meta-analysis is you get huge numbers. You can get like 1 million patients. The drawback is that you're combining studies that were all done differently, have different definitions of their outcomes, have different definitions of exposure, and so forth. So there are challenges which water down the strength of the conclusions that we can draw. But on the other hand, what adds to the strength of the conclusion is huge numbers. So this is how this one was done. And we'll show you the next slide, one of those
Yeah.
trees of how many people, of how many studies they included and how they did it and how many studies were rejected, what they got. Not the next, sorry, it's the one after this. Yeah. So,
Oh, yeah, yeah. So,
but
all right.
anyhow, they did the usual, they threw the usual net out there. They looked at all these databases. They put in the usual search words. They required that a mention of exposure was collected and that outcomes were collected. But every study, of course, as you can see, there's 24 studies ended up being included after casting a net of 3,000. And the results are expressed in relative risk or confidence with confidence intervals, CI confidence intervals. A confidence interval that crosses 1 means it's not statistically significant. A confidence interval that's way higher than 1 is a positive association. A confidence interval that's a small number, point or whatever, is a negative association. And we'll see that in a minute.
So we kind of talked about this with the poll questions regarding opinions of meta-analyses based on observational and cohort studies, or do the individual randomized controlled trials resonate more with you? I think this is important. We can come back to this discussion as we are going into the data now, because I think this comes back to bias. And bias is a fundamental property in everything we do. And if you want to see a lot of bias, use one of those AI platforms. Those have an incredible amount of bias. But an important thing is to be aware of it. And the way bias can affect research is in a lack of detail. And this is sometimes you have no control over this, right? You're asking a group of people who've had cardiovascular events, tell me about the last 30 days of your cannabis use, not the last 5 years, not the last 10 years. Maybe they're not asking about the route of administration or the dosing. Are they just asking about THC and not about any other products they're using? Are they not making, sort of what is a cannabis user? What is a medical user? How are they classifying that? It can all be different and skew results. You might imagine if you're lumping in heavy THC users with occasional THC users, you might see it might shift the results a little bit. Yes.
There are some questions I want to make this point. There are some questions in medicine for which randomized controlled prospective studies are never going to exist because of various reasons, even independent of being Schedule 1 and regulatory reasons. For example, um, which we talked about in a past show club, driving under cannabis. Can you imagine protocol, a randomized control protocol would say, you 500 people, we're going to get you high and then follow you out on the road. And you 500 people, we're not going to get you high. How about pregnancy? Is cannabis use during pregnancy associated with any outcome, adverse or otherwise? There's never going and there's never going to be randomized control studies to answer some of the questions we want. And I think cardiovascular disease is one of these less obvious ones. There's never going to be a study of 10,000 patients and half of them get cannabis, half don't, then they're followed for heart attacks and strokes. Never going to happen. I think we're stuck with observational data, meta-analysis, and registries. That's what we're stuck with, I think.
And part of the issue and why we want to be careful about are our methods allowing us to make the conclusions we want to make is because distortions in the data from bias can exaggerate effects or mask effects. It can go both ways. You could hide beneficial effects and exaggerate risks. And the same thing, you could hide risks and exaggerate benefits. It could go either way. And in our effort to find, the not to let to protect those most vulnerable from exposure to certain products, this remains a constant
Yeah.
challenge. And one of the things I do like about this study is they included a nice figure one. So we do get to see the various databases and registries that they used and where they found a lot of articles. And so if you don't see this type of figure in a review article, it's probably a narrative review. But if a meta-analysis or systematic review doesn't have one of these, I don't know that you should continue reading it. Uh, but just real simply, you can see that they identified over 3,000 sources from various places. They removed about 1,400 duplicates. Um, they were not able to retrieve nine. So I don't know if you've tried to retrieve digital articles, but sometimes even with university access, you just can't get a copy of them. Some of them are still hard copies in the basement of a library or attic somewhere, and you cannot get them without getting the hard copy. Um, and then they had excluded some for using the wrong drug, wrong study design, even one that was in a foreign language that perhaps they couldn't have translated accurately. And so you eventually get to this number of 24. So you start with thousands, you end up with 24 studies included for a review. So we're going to show you sort of the meat of this study, which is figure 4, which is organized into 4 sort of disease or conditions: acute coronary syndrome, stroke, and then a composite of acute coronary syndrome and stroke, as well as cardiovascular deaths. It's a forest plot. So you need to open your eyes. And if you don't remember a forest plot, don't worry, we're here to help guide you. So here is what we consider the main feature of this article. So on the left, you have the year and author. And so these are the papers they use. And then again, you see, acute coronary syndrome up here, you see stroke, and then you see the composite scores down here. Then you see the total population size, which is really impressive. You see, that they were looking at millions of people in these studies. Some had only 85. Now here we have the odds ratio log scale, this thing that looks like maybe if you're a Star Wars fan, like weird TIE fighters. But essentially you have this dashed line one. And anything on the right side of one is an increased risk. So 1.2, 1.3, or 2, or 5, that's increased risk. Anything on the opposite side of one shows a protective effect or less of a risk. And just to make things more fun, anything that crosses one, like this big blob here or this big stretchy one here, means the results are not significant. So tightness on either side of one, not crossing one, means a significant result. And then it also shows here sort of the percent weights of how these studies were weighted for the research. It shows their odds ratio. So if you have an odds ratio of 1.32, it would indicate a 32% increase in that risk. And then you have the confidence interval, which is the range. So between 1.09 and 1.59 for this 1.32 value here. But without, getting into the nitty gritty of the numbers, you can look at this forest plot and you can notice a few things. And Phil, I think you pointed out a couple things in our discussion I thought were really good.
Well, there's four categories of outcomes. First, acute coronary syndrome, a composite outcome. That black diamond is to the right. It's an increased risk. It doesn't cross one. It's statistically significant when you add all the studies above it, millions of patients. Stroke, likewise, is tighter, despite one study that's hugely wide. But when you look at the numbers and you correct for the number of patients in each study, it's a narrower, so there's more confidence, there's less stray, it's statistically significant. So acute coronary syndrome, if you've been exposed to cannabis, when you control for other known risk factors like smoking and high blood pressure and all that, it still remains significant for acute coronary syndrome and stroke. Now, here's what's confusing. When you combine those two, it's no longer significant. I think that's kind of funny. So there are other studies, two additional studies, whose endpoint was acute coronary syndrome and stroke combined. It was not significant. So that's a lot fewer patients. It's wide, but it's not concordant with the independent stroke and acute coronary syndrome above. And when you look at death, there's no argument about, there's no wiggle room. You're either dead or you're not, I'm pretty sure. Um, it's significant. So here is basically the data. These are the results of this study. Two studies that combined acute coronary syndrome and stroke did not find it. The studies that separated acute coronary syndrome from stroke found it for both, found significance for both, and mortality was significant. For what it's worth, here are the results of this study.
We'll leave it here in case there's any comments or questions about this data. But as you can see, this is why we talk about those factors that lead to bias, because you can definitely skew the results. And I think for me, what's interesting is just the wide range of results. Like some are finding that it's a huge risk, like way out here in the upper right-hand corner, this arrow, this means a huge risk. And then others, the risk seems smaller. And, it's just interesting to see such a wide range. And why is that? And is it their definition of what cannabis use is and exposure is? Is it other factors that we are not aware of? I think that there are no endless amount of questions. And I wonder what would happen to these results if they started asking about cannabis use instead of a lot of these studies ask about the last 30 days or so. What if they asked about the last 5 years, the last 10 years of use? I know that recall isn't a great way to rely on things, but asking about those patterns of use over time might be better. Or maybe they give us, so a different association or maybe a stronger one.
And many of these individual studies classified you as a cannabis user. If you answered yes to the question, have you used cannabis in the last 30 days? Then they follow you for 1 year, 2 years, 5 years forward, and they don't ask you again. So you could have used and then stopped using, but you're in the cannabis group the day
Right.
you answer that question. A lot of studies were done that way.
And or maybe your use for whatever reason, exponentially increased or decreased during that time. I
Right,
think um, that is one of the issues too.
right.
Oh,
All right.
moving on.
Yeah.
All right. Happy to come back to this slide if you'd like to discuss it. But just to summarize the finding, for stroke, they found it was 1.29, so that's a 29% increase in risk over what if the risk is 5%, it's going to increase that 5% by 29%. You have acute cardiovascular syndromes of 20%. When you put stroke and acute CV syndromes together, it's cardiovascular syndrome, you get 1.04. But again, the confidence interval for these odds ratios to come up with an assessment of risk crosses 1, so it is not significant. And the association of mortality and cardiovascular disease, there seems to be a strong association there. So, and I think it's important to note some of the things that the authors pointed out. That of the included studies of stroke risk in men, involved 50,000 military enrollees in Sweden, found no association. Another U.S. study of subjects less than 50 years or younger also found no association, and then another U.S. study of subject age 18 to 30 also found no association. So I think there are plenty of instances where we don't see associations. It'll be interesting to start to figure out what are those factors that make it an association. And
Makes me it makes me want to dig a little less enthusiastically on my younger patients because there's less confident data that there's an association. I
interesting.
want to focus on my over 50 patients. That's what that slide makes me want to do.
And another important aspect of the study is that they did adjust for other factors such as tobacco, smoking, and the use of stimulants. There, of course, are caveats to the study. There was considerable heterogeneity amongst the studies, and the limited number of studies did not allow the authors to perform other sensitivity analyses. So I think when we think about heterogeneity, Phil, I think of things like we just talked about, how do you define a user? How do you define dosing and exposure to the product? What are those other things that make these studies different? Or one as hey, if you used once in the last 30 days, we're calling you a cannabis user, and others maybe have different categories of casual and regular and occasional. So those are things that are could create some differences among the studies. So I think, Phil, this is one of your slides, if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, how does it, like all journal clubs and all things that prompt us to think, oh, and make you think about how you're going to practice differently. Let's assume that future research validates that in at least some populations, there is a cause and effect association between cannabis and more cardiovascular adverse outcomes, who am I going to address this to? That was the purpose of the last three questions in the poll that we had. Will you only address it after the fact? Oh, I had a patient I didn't expect. I didn't see this coming in this guy. He had a heart attack, and that took me by surprise. I wonder if he's using drugs, cannabis or otherwise. Or do you think we should more proactively address this in more of our patients, more formally, like we do other cardiovascular risk factors, like blood pressure, like blood sugar, like cholesterol, whatever? I don't know how I'm going to change, but as you know, I'm not seeing the patients like I used to either. How about you guys? What would you do different?
Well, we got one text, and you're welcome to just raise your hand or unmute yourself if you'd like to hop in on some of these questions. We have one comment from Maureen. I appreciate this conversation because I said at a major research conference last year, I kept asking that question of dose, formulation, route of consumption, etc. were not addressed. Therefore, the way the study is severely diluted. Sad because we all know these questions should be standard in studying the complexity of cannabis. Thank you. Oh, great point. And I think we all are saying, enough time has passed where I think the excuse of ignorance when you do a study saying, oh, I just asked them about cannabis use. It's like, well, maybe you should, also ask about frequency and administration form because we're getting to a point where we're diluting down perhaps the risk of smoking. Like, who are the vulnerable populations to smoking cannabis? Definitely, I think even as a simple question is, how do you compare smoking cannabis with smoking tobacco? And I even think that seems simple on the surface. But the data there to back it up is difficult because when you ask about cannabis use, it could be vaporization, could be oral administration, could be topical, could be whatever administration route is available in their area. So I think those are great questions. And the formulation as well, especially when we talk about cardiovascular effects, because if you have compounds in there that are counteracting each other, like we know that there are compounds that block or alter the pharmacology of THC, that could be a huge factor in outcomes as well. So we will throw this next question out at you. We want this is a homework assignment, the next one. We want you to design a study to address this issue in the future. All your papers are due this Friday. But when you think about designing this study, I think it's always an important question to ask, to keep things real, because these are researchers just sitting in a little lab with a computer and doing their best to gather the data and make a coherent story or test a hypothesis and to see if the data can meet that test of the question they're asking. And I think the only way they're really you cannot get one of the most common misconceptions you will see everywhere you go about cannabis stuff is people always want to do a controlled study for harm, and you can't do those studies for anything. You can only look at kind of benefit, and so if we were designing a study, this would kind of have to be one of those longitudinal studies where they track people for 30 years and they routinely fill out surveys, and that might be one of the only ways to get some really good data about this issue. But again, we would have to ask good questions about, I think, formulation and dose or administration form, to say the least. All right, well, moving forward with some of our other questions sort of geared towards healthcare professionals, but perhaps also towards people who read a lot of the literature. And definitely we know the industry has been interested in this question as well, but how can a healthcare provider know what to believe regarding cannabis and cardiovascular safety, or even a consumer? And what steps should be taken to have these conversations? And are there ethical considerations in not addressing cannabis use as a possible cardiovascular risk in certain populations? So these are all questions we could think about is if we know that there is data, whether or not the data is gathered to our standard of fact, we know there's data out there that shows a risk for a particular condition in certain populations. How much of how proactive should clinicians be in having those discussions? Right, Phil? I mean, you put this slide together. I want to make sure I'm
Yeah.
communicating that correctly.
The last bullet is just tempting you. That's all. What is our obligation to bring this up? I mean, I think 10 or 20 years ago, before legalization swept the country, we would not even be asking this question. But now I feel more compelled to bring it up sometimes. My patients who talk to me about their use, you would be surprised if you saw them that they were users and willing to talk to me about it. They're older. They're not your image of a cannabis user from a generation ago.
Well, we can come back to these questions. If anyone else would like to chime in and
Hi,
oh, hey, Len, thanks for
hey,
joining.
sorry I couldn't get on. I finally got Teresa to send me something from the airport in Athens. Um, the I'm sorry I missed. I did read through the slides. Uh, my concern about telling, being um, responsible for, informing people more of these risks as we unroof them is that they've got to listen, and there's a lot of resistance still, I think, um, because the information is coming through in dribbles and drabs. It certainly isn't part of any kind of public messaging like there is, the war on drugs, or these are your brains on on drugs. So, no matter what we tell people, they're still drinking and smoking and carousing. It's not going to be truly effective until it becomes public relations and public information is more disseminated. This is a start, and I guess it's our job to bring this up, and particularly in the susceptible patient population, our geriatric population who is taken to using medical marijuana in particular. I think these are important points to bring up.
So thank you, Len. I think I have a potential follow-up in the chat from you, maybe for both you and Dr. Malloy. Um, and this comes from Liz, who says, this makes me want to compare how proactive cardiovascular risk is discussed about any other pharmaceutical or controlled substance as well. Should cannabis get treated differently than other things patients are taking? And this is, I think, a really great question. How often is this discussed for other things? Imagine there are patients who are taking multiple products. I guess if it's on the warning label, it's something you bring up.
I think, what do you think, Len? I think the opioid arena does a better job right now in this day and age than the cannabis arena for healthcare providers bringing it up.
I I do think that it's taken a long time for that to sink in. If you think about how long it's been
Yeah.
since we've been watching those
Yeah.
um, public messages on, this is your brain on
Yeah.
drugs and all that. And now I think there's finally recognition in the population that, oh, I know that it's difficult, uh, but I still need them. I still need an opiate. But there's a recognition that has consequences, and I just don't think that the publicly the agencies, unfortunately, that are being a little bit undermined these days,
Yeah.
including the CDC. It's just not carrying any weight, and what carries
Yeah.
weight is social media and getting your voice out
Yeah.
there because you're a loudmouth. That seems to be the most popular way of getting a message across these days. So it's going to be a basic uphill struggle, and we will see fallout from it. Apparently, if those statistics are true, that it does raise the risk that much. Although
Yeah.
still, we're looking at uh, perhaps less than fully accurate data. Um, as opposed to the tobacco industry or the opiate industry, where we knew what patients were taking consistently.
Yeah.
I guess with tobacco, there isn't a huge variation in, uh, you know, similar to cannabis products that can, again, have a lot of different main ingredients in them. So, uh, happy to jump back. We do have a few more, just little slides, including a strengths and weaknesses slide of the study I'd like to get to. The authors conclude saying, to our knowledge, this is the first meta-analysis examining the potential association of cannabis use and MACE, performed from observational data and applying the highest quality of methodological standards. And they conclude the increased awareness of the potential risks among cannabis users should encourage investigating such use in all patients presenting with serious cardiovascular disorders. Seems pretty rational. I think that's a pretty good conclusion, but not what I read in the newspaper about this study.
And it's not concordant with the results of our poll either
All right.
before. Yeah. Not all participants today would agree with this statement, apparently.
So some of the strengths and weaknesses of the study, right, is we have to remember that this was a well done study through the methods that they said they did, which is again getting large numbers, millions of people or millions of data points from people were used for this. And again, it's consistent with a lot of previous research on this topic. It's consistent with animal and preclinical research. And some studies have demonstrated a dose effect, but again, this dose effect is not seen depending on the amount of use. There are some weaknesses, and that includes the temporal issue. And we have a little joke about that, whether they're looking at it as one time point for cannabis use and then associating it with an event that either happened before or after that use, which leads us to think about this incomplete data on exposure, dose, and details on illicit cannabis products. And a lot of variable details were collected on patient characteristics. And many studies, again, assess cannabis exposure at one point in time and then follow subject for many years with no re-examination of cannabis exposure. So they could have stopped using, they could have increased use, they could have started smoking cigarettes. We don't know what that is. And there's limitations of using diagnostic codes in medical records. If you've ever worked with them or tried to do research with them, you know exactly what those challenges are. But there are systematic reviews reflect only published studies. And we have to remember that null findings are underrepresented in literature. That is, if researchers don't find an association, they typically don't publish it. There isn't this huge rush to say, hey, we didn't find anything. We didn't find increased risk. We found that nothing, isn't really a major factor. That data doesn't typically get published. Very seldom it does. You're more likely to see it at a research conference than in a research publication. Because remember, publishing costs a lot of money and takes time. I do peer reviewing for a lot of journals, and sometimes it takes a year to get an article published back and forth with, not because of me. There's other peer reviewers too, but they you go back and forth, and it's all it can be a lengthy process. And just to remind people that this is a very active area of research. Here's another study from May 2025, just sort of enticing you to read more about this paper with Camel and all. They found just only risk, only increased risk with the way they did their study. There's also an interest in this area with the industry. I was asked to write a blog for a cannabis company about this, and I interviewed a clinical researcher who studies this, and he just did a huge study with a cardiac database. And he talks about some of the issues we talked about today and his frustrations. And he published a null finding study about a particular cardiovascular risk, and it got no attention. And he was like, I thought this would be like great because we're narrowing down where the vulnerable population is. We're not, exaggerating risk. And so he talks a little bit about those troubles with doing research. So if you want to read a fun 1,000 words discussion with this guy, I also include a link to one of his lectures at a cannabis research symposium, which is very good as well. But that's my bias. I wrote this one. These are some great quotes that Phil Malloy found, a resident MD co-host. He said, healthcare providers should consider becoming more knowledgeable in what is known and what is not known. I love that quote because it is good to, I feel like, knowing when you're off into the unknown versus thinking there is all this information and data to support your decisions. And also becoming more comfortable and proactive in having patient discussions, particularly about cannabis use in general. As we've talked about in our previous journal clubs, there was a study that showed that even just having a conversation with a healthcare professional can improve outcomes, can decrease reported adverse events. It was really surprising. And so maybe you're not going to have the cardiovascular discussion, but a discussion might be a positive factor in health outcomes.
For those of you who didn't see that journal club, it was a really interesting one. Patients who discussed their cannabis use with their health primary care doctors had better outcomes, had more benefit and less side effects. Just having that interaction. It was a pretty interesting article and a journal club we did, 4 or 5 months ago, I think.
Yeah. And they are all on YouTube if you search for the Cerium Journal Club. So next up, again, we're happy to, it's open mic time if you want to chat and bring up any other points. But Tuesday, October 3rd, our next journal club, we're planning a report of a mass exposure event. And some of you may have caught this in the media, but we've been looking into some of the background information about how common are mass exposure events and why do people care about them? Because as you know, like with Seattle Hemp Fest and other organizations, there are intentional mass intoxication events and then there are unintentional ones. And we can start to maybe see some similarities or not in those outcomes. But we'll talk about that. And then for our November 1, we're still up in the air. We're very open to suggestions about articles or topics you'd like us to look for. We were looking at this animal research that is basic science, moving away from humans, but they looked at chronic cannabis use promoting pro-hallucinogenic signaling through serotonergic receptors. The receptors are the same target of LSD, psilocybin, and other pharmaceutical drugs through a molecular pathway. We thought this was kind of interesting. It's in animals. It's not quite human, so it's preclinical, but I think it's an interesting observation that the researchers captured. So we're considering that for Tuesday. But again, we're here as a club, so if there are other articles or things, feel free to reach out to us, drop them in the chat, or you can email us. All right, well, if there are any other final thoughts, anything people like to share, otherwise we can respect your time and get you back out there into the real world.
Thank you very much, guys, for hosting this and for covering this important topic. Really appreciate it. And all your monthly
You're welcome.
bookings.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. I got to run, guys, to speak to you.
All the best. Take care, guys.
Bye.